This is a Willets Point Shea Stadium bound 7 express train. The next and last stop is Willets Point, Shea Stadium.
Oh, yes, it is the Subway to Shea podcast. Anthony Rivera here with you, talking about all the news and happenings surrounding that team from Queens, the New York Mets. Episode 185 from the Subway to Shea studios in my office. Make sure you're following Subway to Shea on X, Instagram, and TikTok at Subway to Shea. You can follow me at Ant Rivera 86. And if you're watching this, you're probably subscribed on YouTube. Make sure you share it with your family and your friends and all the Met fans out there. If you prefer to listen to it, you can listen back on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So subscribe there as well. Shout out to the chat. The chat's going to be alive today. Got a lot of great people in here. Nelson Cruz, Douglas Barnes, Corey's in here as well. Brad. Excited to have you guys in here because Mets baseball is back. We are back. Finally, spring training is here. Pitchers and catchers have arrived. A lot of position players have arrived. And most importantly, Juan Soto has arrived. And here to break it down with me on the Subway to Shea podcast is my guest this week, Ryan Finkelstein, host of Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. You can follow him at Finkelstein Ryan and at Locked On Mets. Ryan, it's the first time for you and me on this show. We've been chatting for a couple of years now, but it's great to actually have you be a part of the Subway to Shea podcast. How are you, my friend?
Doing good. Thank you for having me on. And what a day. The beginning of the Juan Soto era, seeing him show up to Port St. Lucie. It's pretty exciting. It's been a lot of fun just all week to see a lot of the guys in camp, but there's nothing like seeing Juan Soto in blue and orange. So it's the beginning of an incredible era of Mets baseball.
Absolutely. And as Corey puts it, Soto in the house. It's great to see, just to see him wearing the uniform, see him with his bat, see him in the cleats and getting ready for what is to be a great season for the New York Mets. We're going to get into a lot of the top storylines that have happened this week so far. Got a lot of comments from Carlos Mendoza as well as David Stearns. And I want to start off with you here because even over the last 24 hours, a story was written. Actually, it was a lunch that happened between Jose Iglesias and John Heyman of the New York Post. Now, we know earlier on in the week when they talked to David Stearns about bringing back Jose Iglesias, we kind of got the feeling that it just wasn't going to happen, as Stearns wants roster flexibility and, opportunities for younger players. Iglesias' contract would be different this year, right? Because last year he was on a minor league deal. He wants a guaranteed, 1-year deal with the big club. And as we spoke, the roster flexibility is an important part of what David Stearns is trying to do here. But as we know, last season kind of said the same thing about DH with Mark Vientos. Yeah, it was kind of his role to lose, and they weren't going to do anything. And in the last week, we got JD Martinez. So anything is possible. Obviously, John Heyman had this lunch with Jose Iglesias, and this was a very interesting quote that came from Iglesias about the whole situation and wanting to come back with the New York Mets. And he goes on to say that, it hurts because we started something that definitely isn't finished yet. It took a lot for us to get where we got. That's what hurts. I definitely get that it's a business, but it definitely hurts, especially it's a special relationship and culture with the organization, the players, and the fans. Now, I understand what David Stearns is doing here. He was on my wish list to bring back Jose Iglesias. Obviously, the vibes were very important, and what he brought to this team, not only in the clubhouse, but as well as on the field. Great defender. Plays multiple positions, hit very well, but we know the guy's now 35 years old. So, anything can happen and you can go downhill at any point in time. So for me personally, as much as I want Jose Iglesias, I'm kind of good either way because I do kind of want to see, what these kids and what the minor leaguers have. You got Luis Angel Acuna has a possibility of being a player on this opening day roster. We all know Brett Beatty's trying to get back to, being on the team as well. And you got Ronnie Mauricio, who's probably not going to be ready for opening day, but he's going to be a big part of the team. And like Stearns says, you want that roster flexibility. Where are you at when it comes to bringing back Jose Iglesias. Do you agree with David Stearns and his decision and what he said during the press conference?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because during the season, if we were talking about which of these Mets are going to be back of all the pending free agents, I think Iglesias was a guy we were all like, oh, yeah, it's not going to cost much to bring him back. Why not? But I do understand where David Stearns is coming from. You have to really think about leaving that potential room for some of your young players. Brett Beatty is pretty much in a make or break year. He's last year of roster flexibility. This is last year he'll have an option. Luis Angel Acuna showed last year that if nothing else, he could play great defense wherever you want him in the infield. And then, like you mentioned, Ronnie Mauricio, not to even mention further behind them, you got Jet Williams. So there's a lot of organizational depth where Jose Iglesias would slot in. And I also think there's something to be said about the fact that he does have big league offers. So it's kind of a complicated situation where the article by Heyman notes that he has MLB opportunities right now. If there's a team out there that is offering him $5 million and he's coming to the Mets and says, this is my market value, in some ways you say, well, it'd kind of be a slap in the face to say, well, we'll just give you the vet minimum. At the same time, he wants to come back. So like the Mets are pretty much telling Iglesias, go take that offer. You earned it. Go play for another team. But Iglesias just wants to come back. I'm really torn like you, where I could say on one hand, tomorrow the Mets are better if Iglesias signs. But how much better are they? How much better is Iglesias than the absolute worst option, which is Nick Madrigal? I don't know. And I think Acuna brings you such a level of excitement that I think there's part of me that prefers to see Acuna break camp, where you just have such a dynamic spark plug off your bench that obviously could be a big part of the future as well.
Now, a lot of what happened with Acuna is kind of based off of that, like 1 week that he had where he had to take over for Francisco Lindor. Are you confident that we can see that moving forward with Acuna? I know that he kind of slowed down towards the last half of that, final week of the season and into the playoffs, became a more defensive player. And if they needed speed out there, are you comfortable giving Acuna that final spot, as opposed to bringing back Iglesias? Because even Mendy kind of alluded to it during Amazing Day that Acuna is going to have a big part of this team, moving forward, especially into 2025. Now, as soon as I heard that, I was like, yeah, this might be the end of Iglesias. If they feel that confident in what they've seen from Luis Angel Acuna, I mean, I can't, deny not being excited for, what is to come.
Absolutely. I think the biggest part, and David Stearns mentioned it the other day too, the glove is there. Like the glove is big league ready. And I would say he's probably even a little bit better than Jose Iglesias. I'd imagine Acuna would play a much better backup shortstop than Iglesias just because, he's more than a decade younger. So he's got that youth on his side. Offensively, I think Iglesias is obviously a better hitter at this point, but you're still hoping to see that upside that Acuna has. Acuna had a rough year in AAA, but then he came up and he showed some of that ability. I think in a bench role, Acuna would be more than fine. And I'm excited about what the upside can bring. I also like the idea of a guy that could push the center fielders a little bit. If Jose Siri and Tyrone Taylor aren't hitting, I like the option to throw Acuna out there for a start or two a week. And all of a sudden, he might become your starting center fielder and your backup second baseman, shortstop, and third baseman. I think he just brings a lot to the table for the Mets. And I understand them looking at their roster and saying, you know what? Let's give one spot on our team to the youth because the rest of the team is pretty much locked in.
Yeah, with Acuna kind of becoming this utility type player, kind of in the vein of what Jeff McNeil is right now. They talked about having him play third base. Mendy also mentioned Brett Beatty at second, Nick Madrigal at first. When you give away the number 11 right away to Nick Madrigal, I mean, that kind of seems like a sign that, Jose Iglesias is not coming back. And we've been through this. How many players have we been through that kind of had that 1 year, like that awesome 1 year, and we get so attached to him, the fans want to bring him back. They bring him back, and he's not the same. I think David Stearns is playing this the best way possible in regards of keeping this team fresh every year. And we've known in his time in Milwaukee that he's constantly ever changing the roster just to keep them as perennial playoff contenders, which Milwaukee was for latter half of the decade. They still are, thanks to a lot of the work that he's done. So, I am okay with this decision, and I think if they do bring him back, great. If not, we're going to see these kids play, hopefully. And look, we got to see, Mark Vientos come into his own. We've seen Francisco Alvarez. If Brett Beatty can get himself back to, what we see from him in AAA, Luis Angel Acuna is getting ready to come up. We've already seen in camp. We got Jet Williams up in camp as well. Ronnie Mauricio, like I mentioned before. I think the fact that Ronnie Mauricio as well is starting on the road to coming back, even though he won't be ready at the beginning of the season, I think that's also a big factor as into why Jose Iglesias probably is not going to be here.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you even think about the infield in Syracuse, if you bring Iglesias back, it's pretty crowded to try to find time for Mauricio, for Acuna, for Beatty, and a guy, Nick Madrigal, that, you're honestly, not that it matters too much, but there are certain agreements that are in place with players. And I think Nick Madrigal was signed with the intention, as you mentioned with the jersey number, that there wouldn't be a veteran above him on the depth chart, that he's fighting with all the kids to get that roster spot. And if not, he would be one of the first guys up in Syracuse. So, yeah, it's an interesting situation with Jose Iglesias because he clearly is itching to come back. He wants to be in the fold again. But ultimately, and I hope his music career is not this, but I think, it's kind of a one-hit wonder with OMG. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, with it being one magical season in a Mets uniform. And I do wonder if the sequel, I don't think that he could really live up to what he did this past year in a second season. Although I still think if they decided ultimately that he's that important to the team to bring back, I'm not going to be upset at it either. I think I'm totally comfortable with what they plan to do here. But if they ultimately go back on that and say, you know what, let's just bring him back, it's going to give the team another shot in the arm. So I'm good either way.
And if they do bring him back, let's be fair. OMG is in 2024. Like that, we have to move on from that. Maybe he comes out with another hit single and they go off of that. But like that OMG is done. Everything that had happened in 2024, we could leave in 2024. And it seems like even, the players as well as the manager, as he mentioned during his press conference, we're leaving 2024 behind and we're moving on to this season and trying to get to the World Series.
Absolutely. You don't want it to get stale, and every team has its own identity, and the 2025 Mets have to forge their own identity, that they come up with their own gimmicks that'll work for them. But that's also what's exciting, because we don't know here in the middle of February what are going to be the things that we're all rallying around in the middle of the season. That's what makes baseball so much fun.
Now, player on the actual Mets roster right now that's been getting a lot of talking about moving around in the roster is Starling Marte, and the fact as if they should trade him or not. So I want to get your thoughts on that, because Pat Ragazzo of SI was talking about there being a rumored trade, obviously during the winter meetings, where the Mets could have had Hunter Harvey, relief pitcher from the Kansas City Royals. And then there was another talk about a week ago that rival executives were saying that the Mets should trade Marte to the Padres for reliever Wandy Peralta. Would you trade Starling Marte, or are the Mets better off keeping him at this point?
I think honestly that kind of coincides with Iglesias, because I feel like if you were to trade Marte, then you'd have more room on the roster for Iglesias, where he would sort of fill into that platoon with Jesse Winker, not necessarily at DH, but on those days where you have a lefty on the mound, you could put Iglesias at third and have Vientos DH. So if you were really that dead set on bringing back Iglesias, I actually think trading Marte makes a lot of sense to keep that roster free. But how much money are you going to eat on that contract? And I think that's kind of the problem here. If you have to eat $18 million on the $20.5 million that's owed to him, is that really worth it for the Mets? I think what Starling Marte showed us last year is there is still an upside that he presents, particularly when you get into a short season. When you get into October, Starling Marte's ability to give you good at-bats, I feel like that's just more valuable to keep him around. And I am really intrigued when you don't have to stick him out in right field for 4 or 5 days a week, and he's now just part of that platoon role, doing the one thing that he's still great at, which is hit left-handed pitching. I'm really excited to see what that platoon does with him and Jesse Winker. So I think he's more valuable on the team than he certainly is on the trade block. So I think it makes sense to keep him. But again, the one, I guess, avenue where it makes some sense is if you decide, let's just say the Padres really wanted him in a Dylan Cease trade, then all of a sudden Iglesias makes sense to bring back. But I also think the Padres are probably taken off the table when they went out and they signed Jason Hayward and Connor Joe to platoon in left field. It seems like they're already, in a better spot in their outfield. So I just don't even see the trade fit either. I don't know which team would still be on him. I don't know if the Royals would still want him. I think it makes the most sense for all parties to just roll with it for one more season.
Yeah, Marcus Figueroa agrees with you. If Marte is traded, he thinks that they would bring back Iglesias. Jeff Cohen saying Starling Marte could be a good piece, DH and pinch running situations. Look, we don't know how healthy Starling Marte was from the time that he got hit in his hand in 2022 and had the double groin surgery all the way through now this past 2024 season. We don't know how healthy he was. And then towards the end of the season, he really picked it up offensively. And even in the postseason, he was a very important piece to the Mets on offense and even in the outfield. I thought that we'd seen the best of him since the beginning of 2022. So, if they're going to keep him, obviously he's going to probably DH with a Jesse Winker. He'll probably get some outfield time as well. And I think about that because, you look at Brandon Nimmo. There's been talks with Brandon Nimmo during spring training, only 91% healthy. He's got the plantar fasciitis going on. Always starts spring training late. He always gets into games around, middle of March. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be the same thing going forward. How do you go about easing him into the situation during the season? I think him being a DH a lot of games is going to help, at least to the start of the season, whether you have Marte out there in left field. Obviously, we got Tyrone Taylor and Siri, and even Jesse Winker can spell him a couple of days in left field. But I think that, DH to start the season, if he's not 100%, may be the way to go for Brandon Nimmo.
Yeah, I think the Mets have that ability, and obviously defensively, Nimmo's going to be your best corner outfielder, but to have him get a DH day or two a week and stick Jesse Winker in left or stick Starling Marte in left, it just makes sense to keep him fresh. You can do the same thing with Juan Soto, but Juan Soto's got 26-year-old legs, so I'm not as worried about managing Soto throughout the season. I think they probably will give him some time at DH as well, but ultimately, getting Brandon Nimmo through the year at 100%, I think, is the most important thing. I don't think we're going to see him slide into center at all this year. We saw that a bit last year. I think those days are probably done just because there's so much more wear and tear playing center than there is playing left. It was kind of funny to see Starling Marte throwing his hat in the ring to play some center field. I'd be curious. I wouldn't be surprised if Marte got a little bit more run, and very little bit more run in center field, where I could see an occasional game where the Mets just say, you know what, we'll stick Marte in center field for the first 6 innings, and then we'll put Siri or Taylor in there to replace him. But yeah, I think DHing Nimmo some to keep him healthy is important. And he mentioned it too. Like the last 2 or 3 years, he has started later and later in spring, and it's kept him healthy to be able to play 150 games a season. So I think Nimmo, more than almost anybody in the Mets, really knows his body, has really learned working with all the different analytics on how to maintain himself. That's why he says, I'm 91% there, because he literally knows where his speed is compared to his norms. So I'm not too worried about Nimmo, but I definitely think DH is in its future this year.
You look at the season he had last year, it's crazy to think that, that was probably one of his worst career type seasons, and he still had 90 RBIs. I mean,
Yeah.
from May on, I think he was dealing with this injury, and then it came back up big time during the postseason, during that Phillies series. But the guy still had 90 RBIs. He came up in big situations and had big at-bats. So having Brandon Nimmo be, a part of this lineup, an important part of this lineup, is going to be huge. Now, where would you place him in the lineup? When you see these lineups, are you one to think that it has to be that righty-lefty split all the way down through the lineup? Are you okay with just having all the top hitters have to be top-heavy at that beginning of the lineup?
So I had a big show on this one myself, and I can go either way with it. I understand that the notion for most is Lindor's batting leadoff, Soto's batting second. I really like the idea of keeping Mark Vientos where he was at in the playoffs, having him bat second with Juan Soto behind him, because I just think that Mark Vientos stands to gain the most when it comes to getting Soto's protection. I love the idea of Vientos seeing more pitches in the zone because Juan Soto's behind him. And I also think by doing that, you allow Brandon Nimmo to be in a more comfortable spot in the lineup, because then Pete bats cleanup, Nimmo's batting fifth. Otherwise, I feel like the Mets will try to break up Mark Vientos and Pete Alonso in the lineup, just because they're very similar profiles as, big right-handed hitters. So I think if they go with Soto in the 2-hole, it's probably most likely we see Nimmo batting cleanup, which feels like a little bit of a weird fit to me. But at the same time, like you mentioned, last year, he really improved as a run producer. So if they decide to go that route, I'm not mad at it. But I kind of like this idea of going with Vientos 2, Soto 3, Alonso cleanup, and then Nimmo batting fifth. But I don't think there's a bad way to line up any of those 5 hitters, honestly.
I saved this little graphic that I had from last week's show. This was the lineup that SNY had sent once, Pete Alonso had signed on, where they had Lindor. Obviously, he's going to be leadoff. Already been mentioned by Mendy. There's no doubt that he's going to be a leadoff hitter. Talked about Juan Soto at number 2, Alonso 3, Vientos 4, and then having Brandon Nimmo 5. With starting Marte, Jesse Winker in that 6th spot, Alvarez 7, McNeil 8, Jose Siri 9 spot right there. What do you feel like looking at this here? Because they're not splitting up, they're not sandwiching Nimmo in between an Alonso and a Vientos here. I don't know if I think I like the way you had set up the lineup a little bit better than the way that they have it there.
Yeah, I think that if you look at it, it does make a lot of sense to stack your top 4 home run hitters there. I think that's what they're doing with Lindor, Soto, Alonso, Vientos. The only thing I'd be concerned about, let's say, one of Lindor or Soto hits a double in the first inning, but the other one gets out. Just being able to get Alonso, Vientos to chase and strike out and get out of the inning, I don't necessarily love that. I do think that, Brandon Nimmo splitting up Alonso and Vientos makes some sense, just because he's going to give you a more disciplined approach in the box. But again, any way they line up those top 5, I'm thrilled with. I just love what those 5 guys bring to the table day in, day out. I think the Mets, with that grouping, have as good of a top 5 as pretty much anybody in the National League. Obviously, you have the Braves, you have the Phillies, you have the Dodgers, but this is a grouping that, one way or the other, is going to be extremely productive. I think you have 5 guys there that can hit 25 plus home runs, and really, Lindor, Soto, Alonso, and Vientos, I think 30 plus easily. So it's really exciting to see what the Mets can put forward there.
You mentioned Vientos batting second here. A lot of talk about Soto batting second was because of, how he was in that Yankee lineup, him second with Aaron Judge batting third. I think this Mets lineup is deeper than that Yankees lineup last season. And the fact that this team really took off once Francisco Lindor went to lead off and Mark Vientos was hitting behind him, I think that, like you, they should seriously consider having those guys be the top 2. You have Juan Soto at 3, who can, hit for power, get on base, and then whether it is Alonso or Nimmo in that 4 spot, I think that is probably the best way to go, seeing the success that we saw from it last year. I totally agree with that.
I think Pete Alonso's best spot in the lineup is batting cleanup. I think Brandon Nimmo long-term batting behind him in the 5th spot, it's a really natural fit. A lot of times you might just go through your first 4 batters in that first inning if you don't get anything going. And now Brandon Nimmo is back as sort of a second leadoff guy in the 2nd inning. So I really like Nimmo batting 5th. And again, with Mark Vientos batting second, his biggest strength is hitting fastballs. And I think if Juan Soto is on deck, he's going to see more fastballs in the zone, where, if you got Lindor standing on second base and Mark Vientos is in a 3-2 count, I think if he's batting cleanup and you got Nimmo behind him, he might see a slider when he's in that type of account. But when you got Juan Soto behind him, you don't want 2 guys on. You want to leave first base open for Soto. You might say, we're going to attack the zone with the fastball here. And if they miss, all of a sudden it's 2-0 Mets. So I really like the idea of keeping Vientos in that 2-hole. I don't know if the Mets are going to do it, because I'm sure when it comes to the analytics and everything else, they're just going to say, let's get Juan Soto those extra 25 at bats a season because that's our most valuable resource offensively. But I think it would be a lot of fun to go with that lineup there.
It's good to know that Mendy messed around with the lineup all season long. So we'll see different iterations, I'm pretty sure, at some point. And once something sticks, they'll stick with it. And it may be Juan Soto at second. But like you, I agree. I think that Vientos, that 1-2 punch at the top of Vientos or Lindor and Vientos, I think would be great. Shout out to everybody in the chat here. 236 people in the room. Make sure you like the video if you're enjoying this content. Make sure you're subscribing not only to Subway to Shea, but to Locked On Mets as well. You get content every day from Ryan. Make sure you're checking that out. Blunt Thought Sports agrees with you with the top 5 of the lineup. He thinks it should be as the way you have said it. We got a couple of other comments here. Corey saying, I'm on the outside with this, but I feel Alonso should bat before Soto. Alonso chases a lot, especially that low outside slider. He'll get better pitches if he is ahead of Soto.
Yeah, I you can make that case. To me, it just seems like the messaging has been pretty clear before and even after Alonso is signed, that the way they really have been preparing this and the way they kind of sold Pete on it is, hey, you're gonna get to bat behind Juan Soto and put up that really big RBI total. You're not just playing this season for Pete to have a better contract year, but I think it makes a lot of sense to have Pete bat behind Soto, and I think Soto coming into this situation, I think he'll feel most comfortable with Pete Alonso behind him because, Pete Alonso's the guy that he is often seen at the All-Star game each year. And I think there is a certain fear factor that Alonso brings that even a Mark Vientos doesn't quite yet, just because he's so much more established in the big leagues, the guy that has more home runs than anyone in the National League since his debut in 2019. It feels like the Mets. The two things that I would say I pretty much know for sure about this lineup is Francisco Lindor is going to bat leadoff and Pete Alonso is going to bat right behind Juan Soto. I feel pretty confident that that's how they're going to line things up. I just don't know all the other stuff in between.
Frank on X, kind of in line with what you were talking about. Lindor first, Vientos second, Soto third, Alonso fourth, has Nimmo batting fifth, Alvarez right behind him, which I think is a good idea. Brett Baty as the DH. He thinks Brett Baty's going to make the roster. Jose Siri in center field and Jeff McNeil at second base.
I think that lineup makes a lot of sense. I'd imagine it's probably Jesse Winker over Baty, but same left-handed bat in that spot. And look, Francisco Alvarez, he talked about the Mets having the best lineup in baseball. I did a show on this right after. Alvarez can really make it the best lineup in baseball because if he has that breakout, if he can be a 25 home run bat again at the catcher position, maybe be a little bit better than he was in his rookie season as far as everything else, the things that he improved a little bit last year. I think having him sixth is a really exciting lineup the Mets could put together. And then you're so deep to be able to go to potentially that DH platoon in the bottom third of the lineup with Jesse Winker and Starling Marte. It's a really good lineup, and I do like the idea of Jeff McNeil batting ninth as well. I think that really sets the table for Lindor. When you turn the lineup over.
These next two comments are going to lead into the next topic we're going to talk about. Rosie K mentioning Harold Reynolds, which I think was on The Fan earlier this week, saying that he thinks that the lineup is weak, which I totally disagree with. I think that this lineup on paper looks better, especially than last year and definitely better than 2023. And Brad saying that the fact that Alvarez, and I agree with this, is in the 7 hole just shows how deep of a lineup can be. And you just think about it. Francisco Alvarez made a comment. He was very chatty in the first couple of days and mentioned that we have the best lineup in baseball. And I think I even have the full quote from Francisco Alvarez saying, I think we are the best lineup in baseball. We have PD. We have a little bit of everything. We have hitting guys. We have power guys. We have everything. We have the best lineup in baseball, so we can fight with any team. If all is healthy, if this Mets lineup is the best in baseball, do you agree here with Francisco Alvarez?
It's tough. The Dodgers have a really good lineup, and also we can't sleep on the Braves. I mean, the Braves, now they have, I think, more question marks just based on the health of some guys. If Acuna is not, 80% of his MVP self, that lineup looks a lot different. What's Riley going to be off of a down season? Matt Olson as well. Ozzie Albies very much has become an injury-prone player. But man, you really look at that Braves 1 through 9, and they're really good. The Braves, I would say, right now on paper, probably have a slight edge over the Mets. And then the Dodgers, of course, we know how deep they can be. So I think the Mets are right there. I think those are the best 3 lineups in the National League. The Diamondbacks certainly have something to say about after a really good season as well. But those are the 3 teams I look at. I would say the biggest sort of disparity that people don't talk about much is I think both the Mets and the Braves have a significantly better lineup than the Phillies. I think the Phillies have got a little bit weak in that lineup, not making too many improvements and seeing some of those guys age a little bit, like Castellanos, like Real Muto. So I think the Mets are definitely one of the best lineups in the National League, but they have the ability to be the best lineup. You know what? If Lindor, Vientos, Alonso, Soto, heck, even Alvarez pop 30 home runs apiece, and a couple of those guys 40, it's going to be a really scary lineup. It has that potential for sure.
Well, even Stan from Westport here made the comment, if I can find it real quick, saying that having 6 to 7 guys hitting 20-plus home runs, that'll be huge for this line. You can even talk about Jose Siri, even though he's at the bottom of the lineup. Not a great average guy, but he's got pop, big-time pop, and if he can hit 20 home runs, that's a big deal for these New York Mets as well. I think when you look at the Phillies, who kind of were running roughshod over the National League East and the National League for most of the year, I really think the Mets exposed them in the postseason.
Yeah, they did for sure. They did because in the postseason, Castellanos, if I remember, was pretty good in that series. Schwarber hit the early home run off of Senga, but like Bryce Harper was the only hitter I was really, really nervous about when he got in the box. And obviously that'll continue to be the case. And they have an opportunity to maybe get a little bit of a better season, from their outfield if Max Kepler, the sign they made, works out. And there's things that can happen. Bryson Stott can be a lot better, but especially when Alec Boehm really fell off. I mean, I think that really changed their lineup in the first half. Was Alec Boehm played at all-star level and then he fell off. I think that Phillies team has a lot of holes. Now they have probably the best staff on the pitching front in the division, but offensively, I think they can be exploited a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Shout out to everybody. Like I said in the chat, great comments here. Shout out to Jonathan who just joined the show. Appreciate you as well. Jeff Cohen mentioning that Tacoma just reported that Soto hit 4/5 up the way of the batter's eye in center field. Hopefully seeing a lot of that at Citi Field as well. Corey mentioning, hoping that Francisco Alvarez has a breakout season. Now, he worked on his swing, and reporting from The Athletic that he worked on his swing with JD Martinez. Now, if you're going to work on your swing with anybody, JD Martinez is that guy. I know he kind of tailed off at the end of last season, but he was a major part of this team and the culture and how they were able to overcome. Had a big May and June, and then obviously tailed off. But if you're going to learn anything from anyone, JD Martinez is the guy.
Absolutely. And I do like the swing. If you look at Alvarez prior to this season, very heavy load that he started his swing with, a lot of weight on his back hip. He does look a lot more athletic in the box, standing a little more upright, instead of just being so set into his load. He's going with more of a stride towards the baseball. I'm excited to see what Alvarez can do this year, but also you do always have to caution with the new swing. It's going to take some time. It's one of those things where if he feels really comfortable with it, he could really hit the ground running. Maybe there's a world where he doesn't feel comfortable and he ends up going back to what he used to do. But I do like the look of Alvarez in the box right now. And ultimately, I think this is going to help him hopefully stay on time on the heaters and be able to react to breaking pitches a little bit more, trust his hands more. He doesn't have to have such a heavy load. He's such a strong kid. If he connects, it's going to go. So I'm excited to see what Alvarez can bring because he really is a guy that can change the ceiling of the Mets. I mean, I think Francisco Alvarez is already a top 10 catcher in baseball, but he could be a top 5 catcher in baseball this season. So he's exciting to think about what year 3 will be for Francisco Alvarez.
Yeah, we definitely got shortchanged with the injury to his hand last season. It had to play a major role in just him not being able to swing that bat the way he wanted to. I want to since we're talking about Francisco Alvarez and kind of that prospects, some of these prospects, I want to talk about Brandon Sproat and some of the prospects that are being showcased here. Brandon Sproat was one of the first ones to come into camp, and this is a huge showcase for him because I don't think he's going to make the team unless there are some severe injuries to this pitching staff, which I hope they're not. But I think that he's going to showcase himself if he could pitch well during spring training to be one of those first call-ups that the Mets team will need, kind of a la what we saw last season with Christian Scott being one of those call-ups. So if he could pitch well here in spring, show this team a lot of what he's got, we may see him. I think we will see him at some point when it comes to the season for the New York Mets.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you're looking at the guys that are going to start the year in Syracuse, I think there's a chance that Tyler McGill ends up being in Syracuse just because he has that option. And then I would say it's pretty much McGill and Sproat are the two guys that are waiting in the wings to get a call. And, with injuries, something can happen. I do agree with you that the Christian Scott timeline last year is probably best case scenario of when we see Brandon Sproat, which was the beginning of May. I think Scott made like 5 starts in AAA, really thrived, and the Mets ended up going to it. We'll see. I think your hope is that you don't see Brandon Sproat until later on in the season because that means the Mets rotation has really done well and stayed healthy. But he is this guy that has incredible upside. You're talking about now a 5-pitch arsenal. It's interesting to hear that he incorporated a sinker into the mix now. That's going to give him a different look off of his fastball that plays up in the zone, sinker that he can now give you another high-speed offering that he can try to get ground balls with early in counts. He's got one of the best changeups amongst any pitching prospect in baseball. It's the only changeup I've ever seen compared to Paul Skeen's splinker. So that's a really high compliment that his changeup has been mentioned even in the likes of that as sort of a Skeen's light. So yeah, you're looking at a pitcher that has a ton of upside, a lot of potential. He's definitely the top prospect that I think will probably get talked about most in camp this year.
You also even have to look at Blade Tidwell because, with all the talk with the bullpen and just where everyone's at health-wise and trying to keep everyone healthy, I think Blade Tidwell is another guy that becomes very important this spring. And here are the list of so far the prospects down there. Sproat's down, Jet Williams, Drew Gilbert, Ryan Clifford, Mauricio, Blade Tidwell, Luis Angel Acuna. The 4 guys that I'm paying the closest attention to, obviously, are Sproat, Blade Tidwell, Ronnie Mauricio, and as well as Luis Angel Acuna. You agree with that?
Yeah, I'd say so. Jet Williams and Drew Gilbert are interesting, but as far as guys that I think can make the impact the soonest, I think you're pretty spot on there. Tidwell's interesting because I definitely think he could transition to be a really awesome high leverage reliever. You want to have him continue to develop as a starting pitcher, but that's definitely something that could be in the cards for him. And I think Dom Hamill's another guy that's in camp right now that, if he were to focus on 2 pitches, like a fastball slider mix, I think there is another high leverage reliever potentially in there as well. Those guys are going to fill out the AAA rotation, but you never know when you decide to maybe make that change. And there's a lot of really good stuff there in the Mets system when it comes to the pitchers.
We've seen other teams. The Mets don't really do this, but we've seen other teams do it where, they'll have a really good solid starter in the minor leagues and then a bullpen spot opens up. And that's where they start getting their experience. I mean, we saw with Adam Wainwright, a lot of people don't like to hear that name anymore, but he's one of those guys that started out in the bullpen. He was even closing in postseason games where, you have one of these young guys come in, learn through that way, and then eventually become a starter. So if they want to do that with Blade Tidwell, I wouldn't be upset at it at all.
Yeah, and David Stearns did that with the Brewers. Corbin Burns got his start coming out of the bullpen. Brandon Woodruff a little bit as well. So and last year I was sort of making that comp, looking at Burns and Brandon Sproat, and I thought that there was a chance last year if Brandon Sproat had really thrived in AAA, where the Mets might have considered having him be a part of that playoff bullpen. But obviously, when Sproat struggled, it sort of made their decision easy to just kind of shut him down and let it play out this year. But I definitely think that could be in the cards, even for a Brandon Sproat this year, depending on the outlook of the rotation. I think David Stearns will definitely consider that if that's the means to get that bullpen a little bit better, and especially if your rotation doesn't need the kids to help reinforce it.
Speaking of the rotation, some news coming out of that. Clay Holmes, pretty impressive in his spring outing, as well as Kodai Senga hitting 96 on the fastball. You love to see it. With Clay Holmes, I mean, he is ahead of schedule a lot up among a lot of the pitchers that came into camp already throwing 3 up, 3 downs already. That's great to see coming from Clay Holmes. No one knew what we were going to be getting from him, and we still don't really know what we're getting from transitioning to being a starting pitcher. But all of the, the guys that have done this, right? The Seth Lugos, you could talk about Michael King out in San Diego. A lot of positive coming from that. I know he got a little short stint when he was, I think, in Cincinnati when he tried doing it and it didn't work out. But, with the pitching lab, with Jeremy Hefner as well, I think that this is going to be a big season for Clay Holmes. And even I think on Fangraphs, they had him being one of the pitchers to win the most games on this team and having the best ERA. So it says a lot when you have the arsenal that he has and seeing if it can translate now to the, starting pitching.
I think Clay Holmes has a chance to be, outside of course, Juan Soto, the best signing the Mets made this offseason, particularly when you think about the value he could bring on that contract if he is a starting pitcher. If he gives you 140 innings at a 3.5, that's incredible value from Clay Holmes. It's really exciting to see him up to 3 innings already. I mean, it shows you how hard he's working at this. And I think, bring on Michael King is an interesting one because obviously both of those guys shared a bullpen together in New York with the Yankees. I think he could be a Michael King light. I don't know if he's going to quite have the ceiling of a Michael King, but man, he's got a lot of potential. He's a big guy. He keeps the ball on the ground. If he really can round out the arsenal, and there's been pretty good early reviews of a changeup that he's going to add to the mix here. Be able to, as a guy that was always sort of sinker, sweeper, slider, to now have a four-seam fastball. Maybe he can change eye levels, go with the fastball up in the zone. There's a chance that Clay Holmes is the number 3 starter in the Mets this year. I think it very much could be one of Kodai Senga or Sean Manaea or Ace, the other guy's the 2, and Clay Holmes might be the 3rd best guy. So I'm really excited to see. I think he's the starter I'm most intrigued to watch in camp to finally see what that looks like as he starts pitching deeper into games. And, can he see lineup a couple times through?
Yeah, I think I as well am very intrigued and most excited to see Clay Holmes on the mound, especially because every time I post a clip about Clay Holmes, all the Yankee fans seem to want to chime in and talk about how terrible he is. This is a guy who closed for them with, I think, close to a under 2 well, not under 2, definitely under 3 ERA for his career as a Yankee. I know it didn't end well as a closer for him, but even in the postseason, he pitched very well out of the bullpen for them. I think key for the Mets, not only the fact that, Jeremy Hefner in the pitching lab, but that they brought over, I think it's Desi Driscoll is his name from the Yankees, that bullpen, their bullpen coach. I think that's going to be huge, knowing that he's worked with Clay Holmes before, know what arsenal he has. That's going to be a nice tandem to get Clay Holmes to where he needs to be as a starter. And maybe it starts off slow. Maybe he's pitching, 4 innings to start if he can, if we could get him to 5, perfect. But they are going to really work on Clay Holmes and make him an integral part to maybe he is, like you said, maybe he becomes the 3rd best starter that the New York Mets has by the end of this season.
Yeah, I think there's no reason to think that he can't make this work. You've seen other pitchers, pull it off. Ronaldo Lopez last year did a great job with the Braves. Yeah, I think one of the things, and Ryan Stanek actually mentioned this, Clay Holmes is a big guy. And I think that's, the type of guy you want to be able to handle a potential huge spike in workload. And I love the ground ball profile. I mean, that always works well as a starting pitcher. I think part of the reason why Yankees fans sort of sour on Clay Holmes is he was more of a pitch to contact guy, even though he still struck out a lot of batters. But he wasn't necessarily the guy that could load the bases and strike out 3 guys to get out of it. But as a starting pitcher, keeping the ball on the ground, I think also having Francisco Lindor behind him in the infield, I think that's, potentially a really nice, part of this transition for him, is he should have good infield defense behind him. And yeah, it's going to be exciting to see what he does.
Yeah, Yankee fans will always bring up that, the pitch to contact, but we got to remember as well, the Yankees weren't great defensively last season and cost him a lot of games. So, the feelings are probably mutual between Holmes and that Yankee defense as well. And we saw it, in Game 5 of the World Series go bad for them. But, I think that another pitcher, and I'm glad that Marcos Figueroa brought this up, David Peterson, he thinks he's going to be a number 2 type starter. Last year was a huge confidence boost for him. last year was the best I've ever seen David Peterson pitch when he came back from that hip surgery. He might have been, to a certain extent, even better than what we saw from Sean Manaea, because he made it consistent all season long. He had the best ERA on the team. I think he had 10 wins. This is pretty big for David Peterson if he can be consistent, because we saw him when he came up, he had a good start to his career, had the bad season. It was like every other year he's Jekyll and Hyde. If he can find that consistency, David Peterson is going to be a huge part of this rotation.
Yeah, it's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. 2020 was great. 2022, really good as well. 21 and 2023, not as good. So hopefully this is not an odd year where Peterson falls back. But it was clear that the hip issue was real, and that probably can explain away a lot of the struggles in 23. And yeah, he's a guy that I've loved for a long time. I don't know if quite a starter, a number 2 type. I look at him as a number 3 starter, but I mean, that's kind of semantics regardless.
Yeah.
He's a guy that will pitch to contact, has really good stuff, big guy throwing from the left side. I think David Peterson has a great chance to repeat what he did last year. The ERA might not be sub 3 again, but you know what? If he's pitching to a sub 3.5 and he's taking the ball over 25 times, you're going to be really happy with the production you get out of David Peterson. I'm very confident in David Peterson's ability to replicate a lot of the success he had last year.
Great point from Stan from Westport as well, saying that Peterson can do middle relief innings if needed. We saw him in the postseason, how important he was, closed out the final game of the wild card series, had a big role against the Phillies as well. I think that along with him having a great season last year, that postseason that he had, another boost to add on to his armor to make that he will be a solid part of this rotation. I want to switch gears and talk about the bullpen now, because Patty from NYC is asking, what about my guy Nunez? And curious where Budo ends up. So we're going to head into the bullpen talk here, because roles have been assigned finally to these two. It feels like these two pitchers in Jose Budo and Tyler McGill never really have had defined roles on this Mets team. And Carlos Mendoza was very prompt on it, said that Jose Budo is going to be coming out of the bullpen, will be that swing man, that multi-inning reliever. Tyler McGill will be going for that final spot in the rotation. I like that they have Budo with this defined role and that he's going to be coming out of the bullpen. We saw that he has struggled, after pitching, 2 or 3 innings, 40, 50 pitches, that he struggles coming back after a couple of days. So they're going to have to figure that out with him, especially struggled during the postseason. But he was so solid that second half of the season, big part of this team, along with Daniel Nunez. I'm a little surprised that Tyler McGill, it hasn't been turned into a reliever yet, because, and who knows, maybe the switch in his pitch arsenal will help change things. But what we've seen from him over his career is that he's a guy that could go probably 3 or 4 innings tops and kind of, flutters towards the end of the game. So I'm surprised they haven't tried to turn him into a reliever yet. What are your thoughts on these roles for these two?
I think a lot of it has to do with their status as far as options. You're trying to keep your depth and flexibility as good as you can at the big league level. Jose Budo, because just the fact that he has been in the Mets farm system forever and was on the 40-man roster for a long time, he doesn't have any options left. So Jose Budo, if he's not on your big league roster come opening day, you have to DFA him. So I think that sort of locked him into a bullpen role where it's like, all right, instead of having him compete with Griffin Canning and Paul Blackburn for a spot in the rotation, we're just going to have him be that bulk reliever. And he did a really good job at that role. Tyler McGill, because he still has an option left, he just makes the most sense as that first guy waiting in the wings in AAA. I've talked about it on my show. Every year we say Tyler McGill is boxed out of the big league roster, and somehow he finds his way on. So I hope that's not the case, because that would mean some injuries popped up. But I understand keeping him in the rotation just because of the flexibility it provides your roster. I would agree, though, that you look at his brother and what he's done out of the bullpen in Milwaukee, there has always been that potential to shorten Tyler McGill up and potentially get a high leverage reliever out of him. But I was also encouraged by some of the progression we saw from him last year, the way he continues to add pitches to his arsenal. I think I am a little more intrigued by Tyler McGill than I am Paul Blackburn and Griffin Canning, although I think those guys will get the early season opportunities over him just by virtue of McGill having that option where it gives you more depth to be able to stick him in AAA and keep Canning and Blackburn up at the big league level until one of those guys either proves that they aren't a good enough pitcher for it, or if health happens with either of them or anyone else in the rotation.
Canning seems to be the lead contender so far, considering he has no options and can't be sent down. Paul Blackburn obviously coming back from that, the spinal fluid injury. I think that's going to take some time. He's a little behind schedule, so it totally makes sense to have McGill at this moment in time, be that backup starter as needed. I just hope that he is able to find some consistency for himself, because it just seems like, once he gets into that fourth or fifth inning, it starts getting into his head. We've seen pitchers in the past, struggle with this. And, to be fair, even wanting to throw him in the bullpen, we haven't seen the best of Tyler McGill coming out of the bullpen. We definitely haven't seen it in his stints that he's had the opportunity, didn't do well when it comes to the postseason. So maybe it is. Maybe he's just longed to be that starter that just we keep recycling it. Hey, if someone's injured, all right, Tyler McGill will bring him up. It's probably just going to be that guy that helps becomes the filler there for the Mets.
Well, you know what? I think the good thing about McGill, a lot of teams have those guys, and they aren't as accomplished as McGill is. I think McGill has the potential to go on a little bit of a heater because we've seen him do it, where he might give you a great month, and across the course of a season, that can be amazing. I remember, what was it? I guess 2021, I think, was when like Jared Eichhoff was the guy you had in that role.
Yeah.
And, it shows you the how much the Mets have come when it comes to having just depth in the organization, that a guy that like Tyler McGill is in that spot. And I think if you are ultimately going to get 12 to 15 starts out of McGill throughout the season, he has a chance to turn in half of them being good ones, and that's kind of okay for what you're asking out of him. I think he's properly, suited for the role he's going to play this year, and I think he has upside to actually outperform Canning and Blackburn and maybe be the sixth starter when it's all said and done too.
Tyler McGill sounds so good when you mention the name Jared Eichhoff. I mean, how long we've come from those days of seeing, Jared Eichhoff in the rotation, Rick Porcello. I mean, the list goes on and on. I would say Waka, but he had a great, career after he left the Mets. We were kind of like his rehab team, and then he went on to do better things on other teams when he got himself healthy. When you look at the rest of this bullpen, AJ Minter still coming back from his surgery, not 100%. We'll probably see Danny Young, I would assume, if he's not on the opening day roster. They're going to need at least one lefty to come out of this bullpen. I would assume it would be him, but I think that AJ Minter will be ready by the time we get there. Same goes for Daniel Nunez. They're working slow with him. Marcos Figueroa saying if healthy, he thinks that Nunez will be the best relief pitcher. Budo should get a few 3-inning saves this year, gives the bullpen a blow, especially if they're using a 6-man rotation. You think Nunez is the best, is like that hidden secret of the bullpen for this Mets team?
I still think Edwin Diaz should be the best reliever in the Mets bullpen. But look, I think Daniel Nunez is a guy that the Mets really value. I also think at this point, I actually go as far as say kind of shocked if he's on the opening day roster, just because he has the options. You have guys like Sean Reed-Foley that don't, and they want to make sure this guy's healthy for when it matters. And he wasn't last year. And there's actually an interesting article, I think it was MLB.com that wrote it, that I was just reading last night, where he talked about watching the Mets in the postseason, Nunez did, and just seeing spots that he could have come in and helped the team and how frustrating it was that he wasn't available. I am completely on board with slow playing him, giving him an extended spring, so to speak, having him pitch twice a week in Syracuse until you absolutely need him, because I want Daniel Nunez being completely healthy in October. And I think the Mets have the depth that they can wait a little bit on Nunez and give him that longer bridge just to make sure he's completely right. I think this team, honestly, if they wanted to, if there's one last move to make, I think they could still go out and bring in a reliever. I talked about on my show, I love the idea of the Mets trading for Robert Suarez from the Padres. taking on the salary, bringing another closer type to be the 8th inning guy to Diaz. I think that's interesting. You still have David Robertson on the free agent market.
Yeah.
You still have Kyle Finnegan on the free agent market. I would not be opposed to the Mets bringing on another reliever at some point in camp, but I also think that they have a lot of different guys to like. And just another name to mention, since you brought up Danny Young for the left-handed reliever spot, Genesis Cabrera, I think, is the most interesting minor league signing the Mets made. The guy pitched to a 3.69 ERA in an entire season in the Blue Jays bullpen last year. Not a lot of strikeouts, but a guy that has had a lot of success on pitching in big league bullpens the last couple of years. So, David Stearns, there's probably like 40 guys in camp competing for one spot right now. So that's going to be a big storyline to follow throughout all of spring training here.
And that's why, Stearns makes these type of peripheral signings that you wouldn't be thinking about. Like, man, why, when this guy, the Yankees are signing Max Fried, why are we signing Genesis Cabrera? There's always reasoning for these guys. You got to always have bullpen help. The bullpen never stays the same throughout the entire season. And, health is always an issue with these guys. So sometimes you're just going to have to shuttle someone up, whether it's a double header or, some freak injury happens. You need these bodies there. And hopefully the bodies that have been brought in by David Stearns are ones that are going to pitch well for this team and hopefully get them through the dog days of the summer. Now, before we start wrapping up this show here, there's been a lot of talk, whether, you look at the comments that were made from, Juan Soto during his press conference. You talk about Sean Manaea in his press conference, as well. JD Martinez was on a podcast with Joel Sherman and John Heyman, just talking about the way that this team has become this type of family atmosphere. And during the first day of spring training, Ryan Stanek was, quoted in saying that, when he re-signed with the Mets, that they were very welcoming to him and his family. The baseball part is baseball. That's the easy part to see. But a lot of the stuff that goes into behind the scenes, like the quality of life for families that matter for people with kids and stuff like that, that actually takes a bigger weight than most people would assume. They took great care of his family and they meant a lot to him. And, obviously the guys in the clubhouse were great and we had a lot coming back. So it is cool. This team has really transformed as an organization. Obviously we know that Steve Cohen has the money to sign whatever free agents that he wants. He did it with Juan Soto. If he wants you, he's going to sign you. That's part one of things. This next part of making this team feel more family-oriented, more together, and the way that the Cohens have taken care of these players is another huge part. They have done a lot, since the Wilpons have left in making this feel like the place to be. And now if you add on a consistent winner, the Mets become a destination where, in years past they weren't. And I know when Cohen took over, they were building to that. And I finally feel that we are at that, that apex of where free agents are going to be like, you know what? I'll choose to go to the Mets, and not just for money, not just to overpay. There are obviously going to be guys like Juan Soto that you do have to when you get into these bidding wars. But there have been times in the past where the Mets had to overpay for free agents. And I want them to get past that, because they're a good team now and they're going to be a winner. Look at the Dodgers right now. They're just signing everybody, and it's mostly because they're going to be winning, a lot of these games and going to the World Series. So I want the Mets to get to that point. I think that we're finally at that, tipping point where they can be.
Absolutely. And I think the Dodgers are definitely the gold standard. And I think as much as the winning is a huge part of it, and it absolutely is, they also have gotten really high reviews from players as far as just how everything is just so high class, from how they run their big league club all the way down to how they take care of their prospects. And it's a great organization to develop in. So that stuff matters. That reputation matters. And the Mets are definitely improving in that regard. And I would say a lot of times we throw out, Steve Cohen, the best owner in sports. He certainly is, but we should be saying, the Mets have the best owners in sports, because Alex Cohen and what she has done with the Mets Foundation and the way that she has really, helped create that family atmosphere for the Mets, it's gone a long way. And that's why when the players are referencing the ownership, they say Steve and Alex, because of how much they have worked in tandem to really make this first class all around. So that's one of those things that people don't talk about nearly enough. And you're seeing kind of across the board with a lot of these free agents. Jesse Winker mentioned it, like you said, Stanek, Soto, a lot of these guys have referenced a family atmosphere as one of the reasons they signed. And I don't think that's just lip service. I think it's really real. So it's exciting to think about, now we're entering year 5 of the Cohen era. What does year 10 look like when they have even more time, especially with David Stearns making the proper decisions on the baseball front? This is an organization I think is going to continue to raise in standing, where they might be sort of 1B to the Dodgers 1A as far as where guys want to go play. The Dodgers still have LA. I don't know if the Mets are always going to be able to compete with that, but they can compete in every other facet.
Maybe they need a dome, like Kodai Senga said earlier this week, that maybe the Mets need a dome for weather purposes, and maybe more players will want to come here.
It would help, but Steve Cohen has been very firm. It's too much money. He's not doing it. So I think he cares more about building up around the ballpark than on top of the ballpark at this point. But hey, that's going to be nice for the fan experience as well. So
we'll always have that model. I don't know when it came. I think it came out in like 2002, maybe it was, that Will Ponds and I think even Steve Phillips was still the GM at that point in time. I think both the Yankees and the Mets had come up with models of what their stadiums would look like. It was Citi Field with a roof on top of it. So maybe that's somewhere still hanging out. They should put that in the Hall of Fame, or, that little room that they have all the great memorabilia from the Mets, and have that sit out there. Before we wrap up the show, a couple of other little news and happenings surrounding this team. And, Francisco Lindor, Juan Soto making the top 10 in MLB Network's top 100 right now rankings. Juan Soto in at number 4. Last season, he was number 7. Francisco Lindor, big jump for him at number 6. And now now he's number 6. In 2024, it was the big jump. He was at 25. What are your thoughts on this list?
At Just Baseball, where I write, we also do rankings like this. And at some point, we're going to come out the top 10, and both those guys are in our top 10. I think it's pretty awesome that the Mets have 2 top 10 players in baseball. Can't really remember the last time that happened. My guess would be Wright and Beltran in the 2006, 2007, 8, 9 era. But it's pretty incredible to think about. And if you look even more specifically in the National League, I mean, it's pretty much Ohtani and then those guys, I think. And, Mookie Betts obviously in that conversation as well. But it's pretty awesome to see the Mets have 2 guys this good. And that's why there's such high hopes for the Mets this year.
There's a lot of talk about Francisco Lindor and possibly having that C on his chest, being named the captain. Is what he's done over the last couple years, is that enough at this point in time? Are you big on naming a captain? And the last captain we had was David Wright. Is it time to name a new captain? And is that guy Francisco Lindor? Is it co-captaining? Because he mentioned him and Brandon Nimmo kind of being leaders of that clubhouse. Are you big on the captaincy?
I like it a lot. And I would say more specifically what Lindor did last year. I think obviously the play, but the way that he led in that clubhouse. And I think he really is sort of learning at the knee of David Wright and following a lot of the things that David Wright did, because David Wright talked about when the guy's jersey retired, how one of the things that he would do is he would go around before every game and check in with every single player. And Francisco Lindor came out last year that was something he was doing. I don't think that is an accident. I think that Lindor has learned from David Wright. He took David Wright's locker, and it just makes sense that he will be the next captain of the New York Mets. I think that would be a really nice sort of cap to spring training this year to make that announcing official right when the Mets are about to head north, that, hey, Francisco Lindor has been named whatever. I don't know how many captains the Mets have had, but if he can take on that mantle, I'd be curious if he does put a C on the chest, or if it's like David Wright and they just have him name the captain without actually putting it on the jersey. But I think I'd love to get myself a nice Francisco Lindor captain Mets jersey. But he's earned it. And yeah, you could make him co-captains with Nimmo. But I think Lindor is really the main leader of the New York Mets, while Brandon Nimmo obviously has a huge voice in that clubhouse as well.
Now, which jersey is it? Is it the new alternate New York jerseys with the script? Is it their kind of new away jerseys that have the new piping on it? or are you going classic, classic pinstripes? They also have the City Connect jerseys as well.
I think probably classic for a captain jersey. I think we'll go with the classic one.
All right, Ryan, appreciate you so much for being on the podcast. We've had so many conversations, so it's great to actually have you on the show, and we'll definitely do it again. Let everyone know, where to follow you on X and social media and how they can, check in on your content.
Yep, you can find me at Finkelstein Ryan, Locked On Mets. You can find wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube during the season. I'll be going 7 days a week again, so every single day you'll get some Mets content there. And if you are interested in reading about baseball, check out the work we're doing over at justbaseball.com. A lot of great stuff. I lead a staff of over 25 writers, so we are doing a lot of really good things there. So I definitely appreciate people that check out that as well.
Make sure you are subscribing to Locked On Mets on YouTube, and you can listen wherever you subscribe to your podcast as well. You can follow me on Subway to Shea on X, Instagram, and TikTok at Subway to Shea. You can follow me personally at Ant Rivera 86. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you're subscribing on YouTube as well if you want to listen to the audio portion on Apple Podcasts, and Spotify will be up a little bit later today. But that wraps it up for the Subway to Shea podcast. Spring training is here. We'll get into some more action next week and the latest news surrounding that team from Queens. For now, it's been the Subway to Shea podcast with Anthony Rivera. Always remember, let's go Mets.